Let's start the pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Those of you that haven't eaten, there's pizza and there's water in my office if you need some.
So we have the consent agenda. As soon as gonna slide in from a YMCA board meeting, so.
Member Schmidt moves that we approve the consent agenda.
Member Dibble, seconds.
Having a second, is there any discussion? No discussion.
Remember, I had one.
Yes.
Just got buried.
Member Brownell,
Yes.
member Smith,
Not here yet.
Good night.
member Hipdahl,
Yes.
member Sable,
Yes.
member.
Yes,
Okay. Moving on to 3.0 policy IIA. And continue. Without Dustin here, who had some of his changes, is there anybody have a starting off point that they'd like to, with the new OEA update?
on the OEA update, first of all, I want to get some clarity. And maybe Tim, probably the person that can help us with this more than anybody. I'm still not clear, are these recommendations or they're just suggestions or they are their evaluation of?
This is OEA's evaluation of the policy to this point.
Right.
Okay. Say this as well as I can. And Brendan, no offense if I, right? Right. We have a really good relationship with
Yeah.
our union partners, but this is still the union's point of view.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily the school district's point of view. It's not necessarily our legal counsel's point of view. They are here to represent the teachers. And they are here to shape a policy in a way that best suits their membership. But they're also pretty clear in here that, you know, failure to do some of these things will potentially result in action by the union. May not,
Mhm.
but
Okay, that answers my question. It's input, it's not
Mhm.
requirement
no.
on our part.
No. But on the board meeting on June 10th, Dustin was talking about the second sentence here and said that, you know, OEA had some concerns about that. And these are the concerns that OEA lays out. So that, you know, because folks were like, seems pretty benign statement. That second sentence, first paragraph, first sentence, second paragraph. Did I say that right? Second paragraph, first sentence is seemed pretty not benign, and Nathan, you kind of went over that, right? These are things that, yeah, but this is what OEA is saying their problem with it is.
Yeah, and I did read OEA's comments because I wanted to better understand where they were coming from. And my take on that is, you know, that paragraph is straight from Oregon law, and it was written with a specific purpose of, you know, promoting those values in Oregon education. And the section it comes from is emphasis of areas of emphasis, you know, in Oregon education. And there really isn't a legal argument against it. I think some people just don't like it. But I like it. I think these are values that the legislature at that time are promoting, and I think they're universal values that are worth defending. And
Well,
so,
I don't think they're saying that they're not worth defending. They're saying it's a partial list from the law.
Yeah.
It's not inclusive of all the entire,
Yes, yeah,
right?
right, there was that, and I'm not sure if that's. You know, I was thinking back at other policies and I probably should have brought some, but I think we likely have many policies that are partial. You know, they certainly don't lay out the entire, every ORS, they might reference them or a few sentences from them, so I see it as a non-issue. I do understand that there is some concern, but to me, having that in there is a positive thing. I think the majority of the community would agree with that. And, they're good values worth standing up for. That's just my take on that one, absent Dustin being here.
I know, that's not, kind of hard to talk about when you talk about him here.
Well, so ORS 336.067 is where some of the wording came from. And it is, of course, longer than the partial.
Do you?
And
feel-
so it's like, as I mentioned on the 10th, I kind of like to keep the ORSs, at the end and instead of putting them into the policy itself. But to me, if you're going to put it into the policy, you should have the whole thing and not just bits and pieces.
I just don't know that. I mean, if we took it out for those reasons, I'm afraid if we wanted to be consistent, we would need to look at other policies and go, is it a partial quote? Is it? I mean, there's just a lot of that throughout our policies, so I just don't see that, Debbie, as a real problem that has to be addressed. When there's something that the board wants to emphasize, there are certain laws where the language is actually put in. Sometimes they're referenced down below or, the language might be in them, plus it's referenced down below, but I just don't see that as a compelling reason to.
And I think part of the reason it comes across as compelling to some people is the people being excluded from the list. Which includes, let me see if I can find it exactly here. Yeah, respect for all humans regardless of race, color, creed, national origin, religion, age, sex, or disability. I think we really don't need to include humane treatment of animals. But if we included the effects of tobacco, alcohol, drugs, and controlled substances upon the human system, maybe we wouldn't need number 8 in the list of criteria. It's all.
That, were you referring to the third paragraph of so the third one down, the
Paragraph
district
2.
shall not prohibit?
We're going
over that way.
OEA's information.
I think what she's saying is the second part of the law.
Okay,
Yeah.
so,
But
and
it is
so
included. in the
actually,
third paragraph.
336.067, it's 1A, honesty, morality, courtesy, obedience to law, respect for the national flag, the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of Oregon, respect for parents in the home, the dignity and necessity of honest labor, and other lessons that tend to promote and develop an upright and desirable citizenry. That's what this is part of that.
You're okay with putting the whole thing in? That would help. We want to complete, but that.
But like I said, I'm not a fan of putting all the ORSs written out in policy. But when you start picking and choosing is when it gets dicey.
So are you suggesting we put the whole law in there?
What's that?
Are you suggesting that we put both parts of it in?
I definitely did not say that. I said, I don't like to put the whole thing in, but I don't like to put just bits and pieces in.
Well, I get, see, that's where I'm trying to wrap my head around that, because our policies are full of bits and pieces of quoted statute. If we want to take that stance with this, I think it's important to try to be consistent. I mean, our policies are just full of pieces of statute that are being emphasized. The third paragraph down is different. That one's Senate Bill 1098 directly out of there, so it's very clear that we're prohibiting any kind of discrimination based on those things.
And there again, you've left out a few things.
I don't know. I think it's verbatim.
So my observation last time, I don't know if you shared this already, was that's not referenced in the end
Yeah.
of our
That's what I
draft
was just
policy.
looking at too. It's not-
So one simple thing is let's reference that at the end.
It can be now because it was signed by the governor. Actually, it's done.
And the other
ORS.
336067,
067.
it's not referenced as one of the reference, legal references. Um. And I think last time we met, I was saying, would there be any harm in just deleting it? Does it add anything to the policy? So it's one of those contextual things again. That's already maybe a little bit flagged here as could be challenged.
Well, and you missed my sermon.
Sorry. Okay,
I don't want to give
You
it
don't
again,
need to
but
read.
basically,
I just wanted to
Yeah.
restate that that's where,
I'm-
that's where I was coming from for proposing, like, does it even need to be in there?
The fact that it isn't referenced at the end is an issue. I think it needs to be referenced at the end. I agree with that. My concern in the last meeting was, again, after listening to the testimony, reading the letters, there's obviously a disconnect between the community and what we're doing in here. One of the disconnects is that there's assumption that we're trying to limit the number of available publications that are for a specific group, primarily LGBTQ group. And that's this assumption that's being made, okay? And that's not what we're doing. That's not the purpose of what we're doing. It's very clear in our minds that that's not what we're doing. The kind of materials we're talking about could be heterosexual, they could be whatever, okay? I don't see the harm because the statement, there's a statement in there that says, acknowledge the dignity and worth of individuals and groups and their participative roles in society. I don't see any problem myself with just putting the whole, if we want to keep some of it, just put the whole thing in there.
Sans
I'd be
the
okay
part
with
about animals, or you wanna put that in there too?
I don't know the part about animals.
It says, so it says everything that's in there. Respect for all humans. This is why we deleted part of it, by the way. If I take us back probably 4 or 5 meetings ago, is because the sentence immediately following the blue part from the union attorneys, it almost verbatim answers B, and that's why we deleted this out, because it used to be in there. So it says respect for all humans, regardless of race, color, creed, national origin, religion, age, sex, or disability. Acknowledgement of the dignity and worth of individuals and groups and their participative roles in society. That's C, and then D says humane treatment of animals. I don't know why we would put that in there, but if that's what people want to do. And then E, the effects of alcohol, tobacco, alcohol, drugs, and controlled substances. If we're gonna put all that back in, it just begs the question of, do we want to edit this? Because it replicates itself, and that was why we changed it. Again, just to take us all back, we did that last meeting, right? To go back, this is why we did things. That's why it was changed to what it is now, is because the next sentence doesn't miss any of those things, Debbie, that you're talking about. It's all in there. I went through and double checked it a couple of times since our last meeting. But if you want to put it all in there, then maybe we don't use the Senate bill language, but that seems strange to me because it literally just passed.
I think we have to.
You
I-
know,
I
I
think
think it'd be
it's
foolish not to,
clear.
but
Yeah.
so that was why it got edited down to what it was. And Dustin, I would say this isn't a flagging, like, this is a reason why this policy is gonna be challenged. They're just pointing out that it's a partial quotation. Like, I don't know how you would litigate based on partial quote or ORS, as long as you're following it. It doesn't much matter if it's half or a third or a quarter or an eighth or whatever. So anyways,
I don't think
Might
that
be
reason
some-
raised any red flags with the 2 attorneys we hired to analyze it.
So part of the problem for me, so someone who isn't here asked me, so we've made all these compromises, why aren't you happy? And it's like, I have spent years going with OSBA models and then, you know, checking out the brackets and checking out, you know, is there a perspective that perhaps they didn't, that changing a word or two might make clearer for us. And so I go back to the OSBA model sample policy that, you know, their first paragraph says, the board believes proper care and judgment should be exercised in selecting core and supplemental instructional material and school and classroom library material. And that those materials should be inclusive of populations represented in a global society. Another bracket is the process to select materials will reflect respect for all people regardless of race, color, creed, national origin, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. And so a couple of those things are left out, and they're pretty key for the LGBTQ community. And people see that in the OSBA model and say, why isn't that in our model?
Okay, Debbie,
Policy.
what you said specifically, some are left out. Specifically, which ones are left out?
Sexual orientation and gender identity.
sexual.
Sexual orientation's in there.
So just gender identity, I guess.
So identity.
just says gender. But gender is different than gender identity.
I don't have a problem with putting gender identity in there.
Can you explain that? What do you mean by
Is that
that?
in the-
So
Gender's
gender,
different. Yeah.
especially in certain religious and conservative circles, is strictly male or female based on a doctor's observation at birth. Gender identity is more complex and
So a person perceives themselves.
more about how a person perceives themselves, and that's where you get into transgender and
Isn't that a gender?
no. Not in the current political thought.
Was it, and is that the language in the
Well,
ORS?
I'm looking at,
This is the
That's
OSBA model sample policy.
But what's the
And
language
so-
in the ORS? Does it say gender identity?
And the ORS,
ORS doesn't have gender at all. So
No.
this is additional wording. This is from Senate Bill 1098.
It
and
doesn't
yeah,
say gender identity.
well,
I'll look up that language
I
right.
did, it has.
So in either case, it gets back to, are we gonna stick to the legal definitions or are we gonna add or delete? That's what it's coming down to.
So the one thing that you're saying specifically is missing, that from your perspective, is gender identity.
based on the OSBA model sample policy. And there again, I go back to that because
You have a check.
lawyers have worked for
I don't know if it's
So-
an official one or
at
not.
least 2 years on this. They worked with labor unions, they've worked with people, and we're trying to
redo their work and wondering why it's so difficult. We are not professionals.
We're doing their work. I think we're doing our work as a locally elected board to put a local flavor on it. You know, if the concern is the word identity, I don't have a problem with putting that in. I guess I thought most people, when they see the word gender, if you believe in 2 genders, fine. You believe in 6, fine. Gender is gender across the spectrum.
I don't
My
think
issue again is, I think, are we, regardless of the terminology, are we just going with what's in there? Or are we adding or deleting from what's in there? So I'd rather just stick with whatever the language says, and we're talking about something that's contextual. It's not really getting to the meat of the policy. So
Is there any, is there any other
Get-
specific
get
that
it
are
right
left out of
with,
it?
with what the legal requirement is.
Well, so. It's kind of obvious that I'm not happy with
Sure.
IIA as it has evolved over. Our time looking at it. And I am very sorry that we have not gone the route of looking at the OSBA model sample policy. And tweaking that versus coming up with a new one.
Well, I think we've been doing that since December.
Yes.
We-
Yes, and it's still not something that makes the teachers happy. It's not something that makes a lot of our community people who are willing to come in and stand up and talk about it happy. There are people who are concerned about sex education and think that this is going to change that somewhat. Even though there is a part in here saying, oh, it doesn't doesn't mean sex education. But then someone has, well, this board has voted to not follow the process that we've used for sex education classes and health, a new health curriculum, saying, oh, let's not follow this process and let's try and come up with our own and tell us how much that would cost and what in the terms of resources by October. So that puts us out of compliance with the state. So we've got teachers unhappy with us. We've got the state unhappy with us. And I think we have gotten ourselves into this situation by trying to be a maverick and trying to write our own policy.
So if we go back to what you were saying, gender identity is what's missing. Like not to navigate what's happened over the last 2 years, but to talk about where we're at right now going forward. That's what's missing.
Except I'm not finding it in Senate bill.
It's in 1098.
It's
10.
changed since this was started. It's now
What?
way more vague than this.
Yeah, I was
It's
gonna
a
say,
lot
not in
more.
there.
No,
The
Debbie's
references-
talking about the USBA model.
Not 1098.
No, it's
more.
not in
1098
Now
became
references
more vague.
another ORS.
Oh, okay.
and Just
Yeah.
says kind of discriminated classes, I think is the.
Part of the reason,
It
um,
It did.
part of the reason, and I would encourage anybody to listen to those committee meetings on that. There's some very interesting discussion on that, but they knew that it was quite redundant. To even have that bill, because there's already very strong legal protections in place. And we already know this in a lot of our policies. So with that redundancy, they weeded out some of that language. I feel it's important to have it in, and partly, Joe, you know, to your point, if there are some people in the community that are determined to believe we're trying to discriminate, we want to be very clear that we're not.
Yep.
And that's why I like that language in there. Even if the legislature took it out, and we're fully within our purview as a board, and to put that kind of language in.
I don't necessarily. Chad, do you see different? I'm not necessarily seeing that they took all of that out. I'm saying gender or gender identity is not in there.
No, they just reference ORS 659-850 as kind of their underpinning for prohibiting anything based upon discrimination is kind of the way I would
Yeah.
interpret that, but they don't have this sentence that used to exist in the one that went through the last legislative session.
Well, back for seconds, sorry. That's it.
All right. We want to move on.
We're not
We're
gonna,
gonna-
we're not
yeah.
gonna get over the division in the group. I mean, Debbie's gonna have stand her ground, and I respect her for that, and she has every right to do that. But I think moving forward, this would be my suggestion. To address this blue section in the first section, I would address it as a reference in the back. And I would add the words gender identity after gender. Because again, that addresses the issue of the perspective of the community.
So reference it and add identity.
Well, not to add.
you say
leave
gender, comma,
and
gender
then
identity?
comma, gender identity.
Yeah.
It just seems.
It's, to you, Nate, but from when you're coming from the perspective of that population,
Okay, I can
it's very
support that.
different.
I
Yeah,
can support that, Joe.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay, next blue.
it doesn't hurt what we're trying to do.
Okay, but we need to make sure that
Can you do that? Yes.
that
So
we're,
add the reference. Well,
We need to make sure.
do you need?
Oh, he's putting it in.
Yeah,
Where it says gender, add comma, then add gender identity, comma, gender identity, comma. And then at the end, you want to, at the end of the policy itself, at the very last page, we want to reference ORS 336067.
Kind of bottom left. That's probably where you put it.
Right, and I'm sorry, what was it?
You can add in the list up there.
She's just gonna do it later.
Oh, later,
Yeah.
okay.
That's okay.
Yeah. 336-067.
Where it will.
you'll have to highlight all the changes you make so Tanya can see.
Over to the right.
There's a little marker up there.
Back to go. Keep going. So.
Nicely done.
Okay. So, Justin, now that you have a mouthful, the second blue. Legal opinion,
Well. This one could be a little more challenging, but it just comes down to the definition of terms. And so, in ours, we have the whole policy is entitled instructional materials. Then we define instructional materials as like the umbrella of all these other things that are kind of a subset of it. So there was question about lumping all these items together as instructional materials obfuscates the distinction. The references the U.S. Supreme Court has made between compulsory educational materials and those belonging to voluntary inquiry. So again, the idea is just we make sure we're consistent, clear. One thing that I floated was if we call the policy educational materials, and I don't know if that's just a new made up term or just materials. And use that as the umbrella term.
Correct me if I'm wrong, didn't we just use that definition from the OSBA?
Yes.
we'll have to look.
So
I think
It is
the particular,
OSBA's language.
I think the
exactly,
particular,
but it's up in the wrong spot. It's in a different spot in
the
OSBA.
particular issues that we're requiring, we're kind of creating a hierarchy when we say that instructional materials is defined as supplemental, school library, and classroom. But then when you get down further, there's comments about school library is considered voluntary inquiry. It's like it's specifically different than instructional, which would be considered compulsory.
So
So if
OSBA,
there's an issue there and we can avoid it, it'd be great. That was my.
Yeah,
OSBA says the term instructional material includes core instructional materials, supplemental materials, school library materials, and classroom library materials.
so that's.
That's what
directly
I
from there.
remembered. They conflated it.
But then it's up above
So it
definition,
can
it's not in the definition
Right.
section, it's.
And then each definition for each follows that, right?
Say that one more time. So this is from,
So OSBA sample policy,
yeah,
this instructional materials, which is verbatim minus the term, it starts with, in your most recent draft. That first paragraph under definitions in OSBA's would be above. But it's not a definition, it's just a reference, so it's above definitions, and it starts with the term. Instructional materials includes, that's what's different about it from OSBA sample.
It's in quotes, or did we? add
Instructional
quotes?
materials and
Yeah.
quotes.
So it's just in a different location.
It's in a different
So
location.
we should use this
Just,
instead of that.
we just made it more clear. They were defining it, but they didn't want it under definitions, for whatever reason.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I
Maybe it's
followed
because
that
it's the title of the. book.
rationale, yeah.
Well, maybe I don't fully understand, but I think it is helpful to have all the definitions in one place. Under one. Section.
I need a picture of there.
So yeah, I go back to the OSBA model also, you know, because that term there ahead of the definitions. And then the sentence after, some materials may fall into more than one of the following categories. There is a question regarding selection or reconsideration. The district administration may select which procedure to use. But we've got a procedure for instructional distributor, and we've got one for library, and we've got one for classroom.
That's the OSBA.
But really, it's just saying. One or more.
Or instructional materials may include such instructional materials, hardbound, softbound books or books.
Well, what I see is it says some may fall into more.
Right. They contain materials. Sound as a part of the class may be considered supplemental instructional materials, regardless of the source or location of the material. I don't know, I'm not sure this is an issue we want to spend much time on.
We wouldn't have to spend any time if we just put those two sentences above the definitions and take them out of the definitions.
question then is, would that change the functional language we use under selection criteria? When we say the following selection criteria will be used for evaluating, it's not in quotes or capitalized, but evaluating instructional materials. Or we could change that to include the list of categories of materials if we wanted to.
So that's when we start getting into First Amendment problems, when we broaden it out too far. We start getting into book banning.
We do have, it sounds like this like inherent conflict if what you read earlier, Tim, sounds very similar, so. We're trying to write a policy where there's already a conflict in definitions.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, the library materials
Yeah,
actually aren't the same as the instructional materials. Is what they're trying to point out, but we kind of.
But that said it was under the umbrella though.
Well, the term says the term is quote instructional materials, right? First, all these things, then it gives a definition for instructional materials, library materials and such.
But
So-
I think in the OSBA, I have this in another binder, I didn't bring all my binders, but part of education section where they talk about libraries and the purpose of libraries, one of them is that library material supplements curriculum. And so it's a supplemental material of curriculum. It's one of the emphasis of school libraries. I remember seeing that language somewhere, so that may be why OSBA lumped that together.
Thanks, fast.
So it's supposed to say.
So it sounds like. Possibly the root of the concern is. Having one criteria for all materials, whatever you want to call them. Versus having separate criteria for. Different categories of materials. I'm not saying that's. I'm just saying that's what, maybe if you take this to the concern that was brought up, that's where it's headed. Is it okay that we create criteria? For each subcategory of materials?
Is there a way to get a copy?
What's that?
Of
Of
the,
Debbie's
draft.
policy.
Like the.
Of the OSBA.
That and
I don't have the
pen.
pen.
If you brought your handy dandy notebook.
So the
Smaller handy dandy notebook.
14.
Whole handy dandy notebook.
No, I don't need one. Whatever.
you get one.
So do you all see that sentence as different than the one that we have on the next page before selection criteria that says materials that do not clearly meet a definition must be submitted to the building principal or designee who shall classify them into the most appropriate category for review and accountability purposes? Are those saying different things?
Where'd you read that from?
It's on page 2.
Last
right-
paragraph of that
right ab-
section.
Right above selection criteria.
I see that as a different issue than the idea of having instructional materials be a umbrella definition that includes the other subsets.
I see it as something different also.
Like, I think that sentence makes sense, because if you're establishing categories, you're like, which category am I in?
We depart from this. We move to the next section. And Dustin, in the last meeting, is it your intention to do each blue section? You were just, your homework that you were giving at the last meeting was just to say how we've addressed each one of these things.
Yeah, some we've already addressed. And then I came just with some recommendations. In this case, I was recommending creating a new term altogether that avoids this, but I don't know if that's the right solution. I think at the root is, it almost doesn't matter what we do. I think what it's really getting at is the idea that we have one selection criteria that's being applied to all categories. So that's the root of the issue. Is that okay?
I think if you want to take a step back. So, first of all, they're using Pico to try and, the attorneys, whoever wrote this, I don't know who they are, but which is a really confusing case, because you have 9 Supreme Court justices and they all came up with different solutions. And there's 3 here and there's 3 here and there's 1 here and so one of those groups made this statement, not the entirety of the Supreme Court made a statement along these lines. That there's a difference between compulsory versus voluntary materials. But making the statement doesn't make the selection criteria invalid.
I would agree.
The suggestion is that by having
Yeah.
selection criteria, period, that you now are violating the First Amendment. Which means we shouldn't set any limits on anything that comes into the school, period, as long as it fits under voluntary inquiry. And I think everyone in this room would disagree with that. I mean, that if you take it to the extent of what this statement means or could mean. So my suggestion is that we proceed with what we've been doing for the last year plus and continue to fix this to the extent that we can. And there are some conflicts like this that people are going to argue the other side, just
Yeah, I
like
get it.
there's always going to be people that say this is discriminatory. I have yet to see anyone provide a word in this policy or an example of how it has been used or in theory to be discriminatory. And I mean, all of us have been through this a lot. I would love to see what word is discriminatory or what sentence or what phrase. There's a lot of hypotheticals and there's a lot of, what about this book? What about this? I don't see it there. And we keep chasing our tails trying to find it because this feels to some like it's doing that. I would just love to see a concrete example of where that is true so that we can fix it.
Mhm.
Because I don't think anybody in this room wants to discriminate against anyone. And at the same time, I think everyone in this room wants to make sure that children feel and parents feel their kids are protected from material that they shouldn't be seeing, minors shouldn't be seeing or reading or what have you. And to speak to the discrimination aspect, Trish provided some material a long time ago that is in, I can't remember the name of it. It's not whatever. There's categories for materials that are in the library.
Keep talking.
Fiction, nonfiction.
Talking.
Specific categories. So there's women's studies, there's LGBTQ plus, there's, I don't know.
Economy, economic.
Racial, like whatever you want to go.
Yeah.
Did we start? So there's over 400, and not to get into numbers, it's not a tic-tac-toe game, you have to have even numbers, but there's over 400 books right now in our library that fit under that criteria of LGBTQ. So this is not, like, just to speak specifically to that, is not what this is about. I don't think anybody here wants to say, once this policy passes, every one of those books is going to be called into question. That's not at all where this is or has been or is going. So anyways, sorry, I'm talking too much.
And just so I'm clear, like, I'm not bringing these things up to
And it was either you or Eva.
absolutely
Yeah.
request, require change from my opinion. I'm just bringing it up to make sure that we've addressed these concerns. If the answer is flip a coin or we don't know and we need to move on, that's fine. I just want
Oh.
that was my whole process that I brought up and then didn't walk.
And I appreciate
So
it.
Yeah.
I, to some extent, don't have a dog in the fight on something like this. I just want to make sure we're talking about it, trying to get through it. That's all.
I think if we look back at some of the legal opinion we got, so Miller, Nash, Michael Porter, I think he spoke to the heart of what some of the concern or discussion was when he said the draft policies, supplemental instructional materials, and school library materials could raise issues about whether the draft policy implicates concerns under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution because those provisions expand beyond the core curriculum selection process. And then he cites, he says concerning First Amendment issues in general, school boards, quote, possess significant discretion to determine the content of their school libraries, quote, quote, Board of Education, Allen Freeze. So he's essentially saying, but I understand him to be saying is that, you know, you apply that definition, it takes in all those things. Somebody could say, hey, you know, what about First Amendment? And he's saying, no, according to PICO, boards have possess significant discretion.
That gets to what Chad is talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm just referencing
Pico's used
stuff
on
the
both
legal.
sides. And yet,
My concern about what's in here right now is just that we have done our due diligence to ensure that those folks who believe we're trying to exclude publications for specific audiences, that we've done our due diligence and we've done the best we could to make sure that we don't. And that's why I think changing a word, putting a word in there like gender identity, which is a serious catchphrase issue, it should be in it. In terms of all this, the legalese part of it, we've gone through the lawyers, the various lawyers with various opinions. And, you know, we just have to pick and choose.
With that, you want me to go to the next one?
yes, please.
Because I have a transition
Sure.
here, because the next one is directly under selection criteria. And the concerns are specifically related to this idea of unique values, needs, and priorities for our local community. And I know that's back to like a PICO reference, but I think maybe similar to what Debbie was saying before, and forget if we had a comment about this, but it's like, you can see how people can see that as like code language, be concerned of it as being a code language for, well, what are you saying are the unique, you know, values? So similar to where I said, did we lose anything by deleting it? My recommendation at our last meeting, if there's agreement that there's any sort of concern there, is do we lose anything by deleting after the second line down where it says standard? So we would delete to maybe eliminate that concern. We would delete the phrase while reflecting the unique values, needs, and priorities of our local community, period. And then continue to delete. These criteria demonstrate the district's commitment to providing high quality, inclusive, age appropriate, developmentally appropriate resources for students.
What would we gain by deleting those things?
Fear of code language, which I didn't really think of last time, and then also just the legal concerns that highly similar to the sort of criterion that the Supreme Court held in PICO, that a school board could only apply curricular, not library materials. Anyway, it goes on, but
Yeah.
my whole point is, can we acknowledge the concerns, address them, remove those barriers as far as like for those potential continuing concerns?
I think
If we mitigate the issue
Justin,
by not
I think we've
having
established
it in there.
it's on solid legal ground. My concern would be with pursuing what we're doing with that kind of language is it can be a tail chasing exercise because we may please some people, but there are some people in the community that would go, what gives? We like that. We like that language. We also had several people show up who were very supportive of this. And so if we are adding or deleting language based on, you know, a handful of voices we're hearing right in front of us, we're going to be chasing our tails with that. So
But let me just, sorry,
yeah, go ahead.
again, the rebuttal in me, again, not having like overwhelming desire one way or another, but it's just like if we can eliminate a problem. It's not really providing any value, why not? So is there some sort of value in restating our district goals in here in a way that could be construed as code language or lacking in some way or whatever, and just state it matter of factly. So without, the other way to say it is without those in there, this little intro to selection criteria would simply read: the following selection criteria serve as guidelines to ensure instructional materials align with district goals and state standards. Establish the foundation for evaluating and selecting instructional materials, with further clarification provided in the subsequent section. Just a matter of fact thing without adding
Voluntary.
commentary. Maybe you're losing anything there. I mean, it's not a policy thing.
It's long, but I don't know that I would call it commentary. It's pointing to the district, the state, and the community. As
It sounds defensive in that we're trying to say why we're doing it versus just saying, here's what we're doing. So then it begs the question, like, why does it sound so, you know,
So Dustin, what are you recommending? Following selection grade.
I'd recommend, if you guys agree, that if it removes this concern of not just the legal, but the community aspect that Debbie brought up earlier that I wasn't really thinking about before. Why not, if it doesn't? If it's like icing,
Well-
if you think it's icing on the policy document, it's not necessary to sugarcoat or to add a bunch of stuff.
But I think it can
It's
cut, I think it can cut both ways, because when I see the phrase unique values, needs, priorities, and then I go to the criteria and I say, one of them is to provide fair and accurate representation of the many religious, ethnic, and cultural groups and their contributions to Oregon American heritage, culture, sciences, literature, and art. So we have many religious, ethnic, and cultural groups in our community. And this criteria also reflects them. So it's reflecting.
but that's the policy.
The community.
The numbered item is the policy, that's the meat and potatoes. The little summary above, that's not policy. That's just getting into how individuals react to why we're doing what we're doing. And in the case of legal, questioning whether we're crossing a line of someone's gonna say, what are your unique
So what
values?
is,
What are your unique values?
and what
Fine.
what is gained by keeping that sentence? It's two sentences there. One sentence.
again, I think it points to instructional materials aligned with district goals, state standards, and the community. There's lots of words in there: unique values, needs, priorities, whatever. But it's pointing to three things, so I don't see it as.
But are they doing it without the sentence? Are they not doing that without the sentence? You're not,
If you remove.
Here, you could remove the whole
Community.
paragraph, selection criteria, 1.
That's what it sounds like you're going towards. If you remove community, then it's not about the community anymore. Now it's about district goals and state standards. That's the flip side of what you did, right? I know there's a lot of words there, but ultimately it's community is what is highlighted in all of that. So
Wouldn't this
now it's material
district goals
aligned.
include the community? I mean, each one of these could be, you could go down a rabbit hole. What are our district goals?
Mhm.
You could do a whole seminar on state standards,
And
but
then-
then it gets into like, well, what are unique values, needs? What are our priorities? That's just opening up a lot of questions.
so why don't we just add community to the end of the, with district goals, state standards and community? And local community. But it goes,
Community needs? I don't know.
right, I mean. I think where question becomes, what's the motive of putting in local community would be unique values, needs and priorities. Who states?
By the way, I think I read it as a run-on sentence before, but think you would just delete up to the period and then you'd have a new sentence where it says they establish the foundation for evaluating and selecting instructional materials.
Does it clean it up for anybody? Or maybe Dustin specifically, and then others can weigh in. To instead delete that last information after state standards. But to say while reflecting the local community and delete unique through our,
Helpful.
does that change it for you? That's the point of it in my mind, is that we're pointing to. I'll try and channel my inner Gary because I'm positive he had a big part with this. We're not Portland, we're not New York City, we're not metropolitan areas. Grants Pass is unique. And we have different priorities than other areas within our state. So the idea of saying district goals, state standards, and our local community is just that, to highlight that.
Yeah, I don't know if that solves it for me, because that specifically was the concern, is that by bringing up your unique community, they're saying, well, that was kind of the problem with Picos. They're saying, well, we're different than everybody else, so we don't
So
do things
again,
that way. And we
Pico
don't-
wasn't questioning the selection criteria, and that's where these things are again being conflated, right?
Mhm.
That wasn't Pico. Pico was about, they didn't give reasons, concrete reasons and rationale for why certain things were removed, and they didn't follow their policy. They changed their minds relative to, I mean, we can go through the whole Pico if we really want to, but I don't think we have enough time to do that. It's a really, really long document, but the
Mhm.
idea is they were not in lockstep with the group of individuals they brought together. So there was community members and there was teachers or staff that read the books, came up with an answer and said, here's what we think, you know. I think it was something like, remove these two. This one might, you want to put parental something on, the rest of these stay. And the board decided, no, we're not going to follow that. We're going to do something different. And then they didn't give enough rationale as to why that was. And so the question was it discriminatory or not? And it went all the way to Supreme Court, again, in a nutshell. But, and then they all had different opinions, and we don't need to get into that, but it wasn't selection. That wasn't why this was the issue.
Well, similar to the previous item that we discussed about the definition of instructional material, I suspect that the core issue here still goes back to what's in the criteria, because that's really what it comes down to. Whether we say this here or not, the issue says the inclusion of library materials in the definition, coupled with this phrase about the unique values, needs, and priorities of our local community, is likely unconstitutional, as it infringes upon students' First Amendment rights to receive information in the school library for much of the exact rationale already outlined by the Supreme Court.
If that were true, any selection criteria would infringe upon First Amendment rights. But that's the argument. Like, you have to take it to its endpoint. The argument is that if you put anything in writing, it infringes upon the First Amendment.
I think of it a little bit differently. I think it's like, if you want to argue the merits of the criteria, let's argue the merits. But if you open up this idea that the reason we're creating certain criteria is because this like vague term of unique community, I feel like that opens us up more for a challenge than anything else. I'd say challenge meaning like legal hurdles.
I think it does.
That's why I think it's just like the simpler you say, it's like, no, here's the criteria.
Good. I don't follow what you're saying at all, but go ahead.
I think it does clean it up if we take out the inner Gary part, unique values.
I don't know who wrote that, but
No, yes, but
I was in the.
and just say the district goals, state standards. And local community.
Yeah, diatribe and follow.
So I have a problem with local community, local unique community. And that there are individuals in every city that may not be a majority for that community, but they have a right to a minority position. You know, there are hardcore far right religious people in New York and Portland. And there are people in this community who do not fit that definition. And to force everyone into a majority position is a tyranny on the minority. And I think that's a direct problem with First Amendment rights.
If that's what you heard me say, that wasn't what I said.
That's, well,
I
so
didn't
anyway,
say anything about forcing a minority into a majority position.
when you're talking about unique community, you're
That's.
leaving somebody,
Elected
you're,
by this unique community.
you're
We're here
leaving
to represent
somebody,
those individuals.
what's that?
We are here to represent the community that elected us.
We're here to represent the entire community.
Yep.
Not just the people who voted for us.
But we were elected to be in this room to have these discussions, yes?
Yes.
And so that's what we're doing. It's not about forcing a majority opinion on a minority. Again, we're following district goals, state standards, and reflecting the local community. Like, I don't see anything about that that says you can't have your opinion, you can't read what you want to. Like, none of this says that. This is just setting up a framework for ways in which things are selected.
When you say unique community, it's putting a definition in there that's not obvious to everyone. You know, and I thinking about this. Nobody wants to expose anybody to pornography. And technically speaking, it's against the law. But beyond that, morally, we all have that same core value, I believe, that we don't want pornography. But there are different definitions of what that means. And for some, it's very tight, and for some, it's a little looser. And so then it gets tricky when you're trying to say exactly what you want and say not pervasively vulgar, obscene, or pornographic, and then the definition to me comes across as very vulgar, a little obscene and pornographic. So that's, you know, just one person's viewpoint on this. But I find it very disturbing. And I find it disturbing to say, oh, Grants Pass has a different viewpoint totally, completely from Portland or New York, when we have a lot of Grants Pass people in Portland and New York. And we have people here who want to go to Portland and New York. And so they're, again, trying to be protective, you're being exclusionary in this wording.
Just for context, the other comments I had were all dealt with, so this is the last of my stuff. And then we could certainly talk about 25 days and item 7 or 8 or whatever that
7.
we had comments about. I think I'm moving towards being more opinionated on this one, that I don't see the argument for leaving it in when there's essentially only a downside.
Mhm.
You have Debbie representing the I heard something in their community. There's something, that I don't get, and so it's code for something. And then you have legal saying, yeah, if you're establishing your reasoning for selection criteria on the fact that you're a unique community, that sounds a lot like this unconstitutional thing over here where you're kind of saying, hey, we do things different in Grants Pass, so we don't, include everybody. So I don't know I haven't heard the argument why it's so important to have it in, because it really doesn't matter. How or why we created the selection criteria, and that we explain all those things when it opens up all these vague terms. When we have a selection criteria, that's the meat and potatoes, and that's what's gonna really come down to, whether those things are. Legal, constitutional. Right?
I think, I'm in agreement with you on this. I think that it's even bigger than this, and this goes beyond the pornography conversation or anything of that nature. To me, when you say the following selection criteria serve as guidelines to ensure instructional materials align with district goals and standards while reflecting the unique values and needs and priorities of our local community. When you talk about materials have to align with our local community, I struggle with that, because from an education standpoint, I want our materials to be broad ranged. I mean, I want kids to learn about things that are not reflective of this community, so that when they go out in the world, they know how to deal with those things, whether it's work with them or work against them. I think this does exactly that beyond. I mean, it could be politics, it can be religion, it can be whatever. We want our kids to be we want our kids to be classically educated, where they understand the world, not just our local community. And that feels like that to me. I think the period after standards is appropriate and takes that potential misunderstanding out of there.
I understand the arguments. If that's what it takes to get us over top dead center, so we can move along and possibly even go home tonight. I'm not totally against striking that to simplify the sentence, but I do want to point out that the language about boards representing their unique communities is ubiquitous. If you go to the National Boards Association, there's language in there. When we hired a superintendent a few years ago, it was very clear, and that language was used constantly. About hiring someone that's a good fit for the community. I wasn't on the board at that time, but I got to be a part of shaping up some of the some of that process and the things that were being looked for by the firm that was running that for us. But I mean, that sort of thing is ubiquitous language. So I think to characterize, I understand some people may feel like it's some sort of a jab or something like that, but to characterize it that way is not fair or accurate. And that language is used everywhere, and the same language would be used in Portland, wherever you go, they would be saying the same things. So I'm okay striking it to get us past this, but let's not, let's take it for what this all is as we move forward.
Well, I'm a little bit more stringent on, if we're striking that, then I think we strike the whole sentence. Because I don't want to highlight one thing over another, and I think that's why it's in there. And I am positive that one of our board members that's not here would be very irate about this.
I would really love to hear Gary's thoughts, because I'm pretty certain that was some of his language. And it was one of my concerns at this juncture of not having everybody at this meeting, because we're kind of at the end and just like the final finishing polishing touches, and we certainly don't want to have to move forward and then come back again.
Or we do have an option to have an hour-long meeting on IIA after the board meeting on July 1.
Excited for.
How long is the
when.
board meeting in July gonna be?
We think short, if we keep it just to what needs to happen as far as organizing of the board and all of that sort of stuff. So if you're concerned about getting Gary here to have this conversation,
We can do it without Gary. I'm
Yes,
just,
you
I'm
may.
kidding. Can you clearly state what it is your idea would be?
The point of that sentence
Or
is
just
to say that
Like if you were
instruction,
just matter of fact, strike this, do that, what would it look like?
Tanya tells me the board meeting is gonna be about 90 minutes and then another hour after for IIA. if that's what we want to do.
And executives.
And an executive session, which will be very short. There's not a lot to delve into there.
What was your question?
Just if you were to grab a highlighter, red pen, what are you saying?
Is that if we're getting rid of any of those key terms, district goals, state standards, or reflecting the local community, then I say we strike all of it. I think those three go together. If you get rid of one of them, you get rid of all of them. That would be my suggestion if we're gonna have to make a decision on that right now.
You know, explain why.
So then you delete the whole paragraph.
In my mind, again, I didn't craft this.
At some point, it doesn't, it just goes back to like,
Yeah, just selection.
the
criteria.
following selection criteria will be used for evaluating instructional materials,
No, I haven't read past that at this juncture, but
which
I was
is fine
wondering
by
if there's
me.
other two,
Oh.
but. One of the big things about Senate Bill 1098 is the concern for loss of local control. And here we are going through our own document that we're attempting to craft selection criteria and a policy that fits our instructional materials. But yet we're gonna strike out local community. That doesn't make sense to me.
That's an interesting point you bring up, because when that bill was first crafted, it was widely pushed back against, and not just by communities like Grants Pass or, you know, that sort of thing. There was a lot of concern across the board about local control with that. And so anyway, I'm just pointing that out because you brought that up. I think there have been some characterizations. I know a couple of us wrote a letter in opposition of it. It was characterized as though they, you know, they just didn't like that bill. Well, there was districts all over Oregon that were concerned about that bill and actually still are. And it's not down some kind of ideological line. It's a local control thing.
So anyways, that's one of the other reasons why I feel that way. So I don't want to highlight one over the other. So I don't want to highlight state standards over our local community. I want to highlight district goals over state standards. I don't want to highlight, I think if we get rid of something, we get rid of all of it. Or we apparently eventually discuss it on the first.
What about that first sentence? I mean, why all of it? Chad? Just that first sentence?
See,
Because it has district goals and
district
state
goals gets at the community. I mean, that's,
Mhm.
that defines
Just
it. in the
after
community.
state standards, period.
That's what Joe proposed.
And again, I'm concerned, what concerns me after listening to the conversation, again, it gets down to this potential myopic view of the education program in general, that it's gonna really focus on what we just do here. Is that it could potentially be that that Grants Pass is the center of your education. That's what you should learn about more than anything else. And you know, I don't want to give that perspective. I don't think it's necessary. I think when you have district goals in there, you've addressed the local community when you say district goals.
I would love to hear Gary's thoughts on that. I'm not against having that specific discussion if we hang this on a hook and just let him weigh in on that if we get together after on July 1st.
Okay, moving on.
Sure.
One tiny other thing there, that once we get back into it, just to keep in your minds, is the word guidelines in that first sentence kind of like is jarring to me. Are they guidelines?
Where are you?
Guidelines aren't rules. They don't, it doesn't.
How about
Seem like-
serve to ensure?
Yeah, I'm just saying, I don't know, but it does go on later to say the following selection criteria will be used. So there's clarity there, but we don't have to debate that right now. Just popped out of me. Yelling at. Sorry.
Anything else you want to bring up in that subject? Or that line?
Yeah, item 7 and 25 days.
Okay, let's go. There's me. All right,
You're done with your list? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a recap of what I shared in the previous meeting. And we've gone through it, whether changes have been made or whatever, it is what it is. And then I just threw out 25 and 7 because
Yeah.
to me, that's what I heard. As far as We're kind of 50-50 on. Pass it as is versus I've got concerns, and when I heard concerns. Those are kind of the two main ones.
I think those were the two.
I don't know if there's other ones that are on the list that we need to look at. but-
We want to save that for July 1st. So we're gonna dive back into this. I just.
Well, we have 10 more minutes.
6, oh, that's right, it did say the 6:30 agenda. Okay, Dodgers game still going.
Reds have tied it up.
Okay,
How
when you wanna
softball,
start with, Joe?
Well,
25 days or
They won the
something?
first one, 1-0.
good.
Listening to the conversations that went on all this time. I don't have a problem with 25 days. I think we really compromised to get down to 25 days, and you want to get through. I think the bigger issue is, what does that mean? What happens during the 25 days?
That's on their side of the fence.
Right. Yeah, to me, I just see it as the 25-day period, that it just the same as what we do with curriculum. People put eyeballs on it on the front end, community involvement, parental involvement, they have a chance to look at it, there's concerns. If there are concerns, which I'm,
But that's not what this draft policy said.
But the hows.
they're
Because
good. with how we're-
that's, I think what we need to add clarity to. Because this isn't saying you have 25 days for the community to be part of the process in selecting the materials. The materials have been selected,
No, it's a review period, just like we do with curriculum.
but that's not what our policy is saying here. So we need to be clear on that. If that's what you want, we need to change it. And I think that's where there's either confusion or concern about it.
Well, I think we talked pretty thoroughly through this and just kind of decided that it will be spelled out in
They are.
AR. I mean, I don't know that we need to tie our tail or not.
But that's the concern that we've heard though. What happens during those 25 days? In my mind, the way it's written. If somebody objects to the material that's posted in the 25-day waiting period. It's really no different than a challenge. Because it's already been selected. It's just they've had the opportunity.
Challenges are official. Challenges are, they have to fill out a challenge form and.
I know, but that's what, we haven't said that anything otherwise is gonna happen, so that's what would need to happen. Been selected.
When curriculum is selected, it's not purchased and distributed when it's going through the 30-day public review.
Say that again.
When
I think what
curriculum
you're
is
missing
selected.
and what I'm saying is,
Yeah.
it says here, all school library materials will be selected by a librarian. Following established selection criteria. The period. We haven't changed the selection process in this policy. So whatever that process is that's been established will continue. Material it'll be selected. And we start out the next paragraph, like when selections are made or once selections are made. They'll be listed for 25 days. So I think that's where there's either concern or not, I don't like the word confusion, concern over what's happening in the 25-day period.
Well, I think it's fair to say that we might want to do some clarification there. But, for sake of time, maybe it's something we think about and come back with ideas on how to clarify it July 1st.
But my question for you is, are you advocating that we actually change the selection process? Because that's what I'm hearing from you is your understanding of this policy is that it's actually changing the selection process. Which that's not how I read it.
I thought we were
Stuff.
made very clear to us that whatever we're selecting would fall under our selection criteria as outlined in the policy.
That's,
Not necessarily the process of how the books are ordered, but that when we order them, they would fall under.
meaning
the policy.
whatever we currently have for community involvement in our library book selection process would continue under this policy. Whatever community involvement there is. And we would add a 25-day publication period that this is coming in 25 days. That's the way I read the policy.
thought it was interesting in listening to some of the comments made at the last meeting and thinking about where we arrived at this. I know it was my understanding that we were trying to avoid the First Amendment problems of book banning by adding this 25 days. But it sounded like the professionals in the room felt that that did not go around that First Amendment problem, that this would be, unless we followed the exact kind of process of the challenge in place, that it would be more of a book banning than
I heard that argument, Debbie, but then I started thinking about it, and it's no different than the challenging. It's really, it's no different than when the books get in the library and somebody in the community or somebody who's a parent can challenge the book. They can still go through the process of doing
But
it.
I think well, there again, problem not having all of us here. But it was my understanding we were trying to get around that process, and I don't think we can. I think if a book is challenged, the person challenging it needs to read the book, they need to go through the process, we need to come up with a committee. And have all of them read it also and go from there.
I think that's what this board needs to be on the same page about, whether it's agree or not, because when you mentioned, that it's similar. And then I kind of retorted that I don't believe that's what this says. I think we all need to get on the same page about what it says right now. We agree that that's where we want to be. And then and what I'm saying, I'm fine with it, how it is right now, because to me, this is about giving parents the opportunity to see what books were selected in the library before they hit the shelves, period. And all the other processes, in my mind, we haven't changed it. It's that, oh, that book's about to hit in 25 days. Let me take a look at it, But if they have a problem with it, we have policies and ARs and things about how to challenge it. And that doesn't change. If the idea is that we wanted to change it, that's a whole different conversation. And that's not, I don't think what's in here, and maybe that's where there's
Yeah, I think we need to move.
concern about it.
If I was channeling Gary, and Gary, if you listen to this later on, and I get it wrong, I apologize, but I think his intent was that, because he said it to me previously, it's easier to keep a book out than to get a book out once it's in. Before you make the purchase, I think that's the intent of the 25 days, right? Is that
That's my understanding.
we put it out there on a list and someone says, oh my goodness, you can't have that book. Because, and they send in a challenge. But Gary is also very much opposed to blanket challenges to every book, right?
Yes.
He didn't want that either. So he was trying to
Clear about that.
figure out a way to say, this is a concerning title. And please review it before the purchase. That's how I interpreted the 25.
And I agree with that. And I've said that before too, right? And
That's the spirit.
That was
Am I,
the spirit of what
am I
Rich
correct?
wrote.
But I don't think that requires, I mean, again, under the same procedures we have right now. It doesn't require a change to anything that's mentioned here. Parents have that opportunity. Technically, it's been selected, but it's not on the shelves yet. It's in a different category of life and changes kind of the burden of proof, if you want to say that. It's just a very quick.
Yeah.
Hey, we're challenging the selection because of this, that, and that, and puts a spotlight on it. And everybody looks at it before it goes into the library,
Gary, think about it and come back July 1st with ideas.
Yeah,
right?
Nathan's
But
already
it would
typed
have to be
that.
a challenge. It's not,
He's
I
ready to
don't
leave.
think it's any different
He's
unless
just
this
in.
board wants to talk about. Creating a new process. It's kind of getting in the AR category, but we'd have to change the language here to say that there'll be a different process in that 25-day period.
So yeah, this was front end language, harkening back to the very first sentence in the policy. That says instructional materials. The board is legally responsible for selection of instructional materials with the assistance of district personnel and involving parents, students, and community members. Blah, blah, blah. So this is giving an opportunity for before books are made available to students. What I'm not solid on, what I'm hearing you say is whether or not you think that would then require a reconsideration request. As opposed to what the original intent was, and then we very much took a red pen to this paragraph from what it used to be and needled it down to these 2 sentences. As I recall, it had more information that maybe helped make that more clear, but maybe made it more fuzzy for others. But that there was involvement with the superintendent and that there was, that could be sent to the district office to double check. Does this actually meet selection criteria before it's made available for student use? All that stuff was there to some extent, maybe not clear enough for whoever.
It was.
So I agree with that, and again, that's why I'm pointing out, maybe go grab some random person off the street and have them read this and ask them, has the library book been selected yet before the 25 days or not?
Well,
And if you just read what it says, that's what it says. So I'm
Meaning
acknowledging what you're saying, that
reconsideration is what you're saying is the next
there's
step.
some folks that are thinking of this in terms of it's part of the process of selection. And we can talk about that. That's just not what, in my opinion, that's not what this says. It
Because
to
this
me
is-
clearly
this
says
is only
the librarian selects it.
The
It's
AR.
been
It's not the
selected.
AR.
It's simultaneously publicized. It doesn't mean
But-
it's up for debate on whether it's been selected. It's now in that category of challenge or reconsideration, if that's.
The AR takes.
So it
The AR
depends
takes
upon
care
what
of
the AR says.
This is.
Yeah, but I just don't
the
see at that
expectation.
point if there's a difference.
How it happens is the AR, which is their,
Yep,
And I think that is
But,
clear.
but we would need to say is, are we telling the district that this 25-day period has a different AR than after it's in the library? Well, then we should say that. That's where there was concern. I
Say
think.
that again.
I don't,
We're saying that
Heard
the
that.
district will have a different AR for this 25-day than they would have for a regular book challenge.
Or it can be a carve
It
out.
could
And an
potentially
AR
be a
doesn't
different
have
one,
to
let's
be.
put it that way.
Be carve out, not a separate AR itself, but part of the AR.
It's also
It wouldn't be the same
the difference
AR.
between selection and purchasing, because what you said today is different than how we have left other meetings.
What I said or what,
This conversation is different than how we have left other meetings.
well.
So how it was
interpreted.
interpreted before is that the books are, as we talked about, the fact of the timeline that it takes, it's not like you buy a book and you get it the next day and it's processed and on the shelf. I mean, there's it takes some time. And so but there's also quotes and timelines on quotes and purchasing deadlines. And so where you put a delay, no matter what the purpose of that delay is, it's still a delay, impacts the process and procedures of the library system. So how I interpreted how we had discussed it previously is that the books are selected and purchased, but they're not on shelves until after a public comment length of time, whatever that time is. That's how we have left previous.
and I think,
That's what was said.
isn't that
Right,
why we
that's what
put
was said.
before being made available for
Yes.
students?
Being
But
made.
the reality is, from a
But just
policy
because we talked
standpoint,
about selection, not purchase.
well, because
That's a different.
I have a superpower. I can just read what's here and just ignore everything else. I'm just reading what's here.
I'm
And we eliminated the word
what you say is
Purchase
not-
because it was like, hey, that's not our deal. Like whether it's purchased a month from now or 10 months from now or tomorrow. All we're saying is
And
make the selection, put it on a list. And then all that other
With
stuff.
the list
before it was
available,
made available.
receive
That stuff can get figured out.
But
The whole reason why it's 25 days, not 30 days, is because of that quote. So it did allow for 25 days to pass before things were purchased. That is why it's 25, not 30. Well, I know, I'm just,
There.
but that's how we got to 25. His quotes are good for 30 is what we were told.
Must
So,
be only
For anything, I'm
Maybe
glad
short of
bringing
that
this up
allowed
at risk
for-
of like, you know, sounding all over the top about it, is because this board is not on the same page about what is actually written in here and what it means. Whatever side of that you're on, of whether you want to add more procedural or change the procedure during the 25 days, or you don't, or you want to talk about purchases or whatever. I don't think everybody clearly reads this the same way.
Not everybody on the board, not everybody in administration, and not everybody who actually.
It
has
doesn't
the input.
input until the AR has been created
I
or.
thought that was what we got to when we cut out all
Yeah,
the stuff
right.
that tried to explain it. Was that we were gonna allow for that to be
Well,
figured out through the AR. And then we can look at that at some point in time and find out, did it actually?
we cut.
Well,
more specifics out for that
this-
purpose.
From an opinion standpoint, where I land on this is, I'm happy how it's written with just publicizing the darn books 25 days before they hit the shelves. Everything else can be the same. Someone doesn't like a book, they have to go through a formal challenge process. Great.
If
I'm
you,
happy with that process.
Yeah,
Like,
if
to me,
you-
that's the win, and whether it was Joe or me that first recommended the 25 day or
Yeah.
whatever the number day delay was, it was in the whole arena of just having as much transparency as possible, giving folks in the
letting parents
community-
be informed.
the time to be informed before it hits the shelves. And this is almost in its simplest form. It's just saying that we're accomplishing that one thing.
So. Gary mentioned to me that he said, you know, Debbie, I almost said something about you're the most fiscally conservative member on the board.
I heard you say that.
And, you know, I think about, you know, here we have a book that we were gonna buy one of, now we need to buy 12 of for the committee.
Oh, we've got several dozen books back there that nobody wants to
Oh.
read.
So that's just my little fiscal responsibility input on the progress.
Would it make sense just to say all school library? Maybe it doesn't make sense to say this, so I'm just gonna throw it out. All school library materials will be selected and purchased by the librarian following established
That's what we have now.
selection criteria.
Tim, does it make a
then-
difference?
I don't think that helps anything.
Okay.
Does it make
I
a
didn't,
difference?
I didn't hear the change. What was
The change was selected and purchased.
Oh,
Does that make a
I don't
difference
think
for
that-
Gary's point of view?
That means they're purchased before 20.
I think spell it out in AR. I mean, if we're gonna open
Yeah.
this up again in July
Yeah.
1st, let's see what Gary's thoughts are, but. You know, spell it out in AR.
Yeah.
So for the record,
Right.
I feel like this conversation is going further away from some of the comments I heard than trying to address them. For whatever that's worth. Because I was already concerned about 25 days and what that means. So that if we're moving in a direction that's saying
I think
it's
the 20
easier
yeah.
to get a, you know, send Tim an email and get that book off the list or whatever. I think that's the concern. And so if we're starting to create a different process for the 25 days,
So let me
it'll increase that concern.
give you a timeline of what we've got going on so that we're all on the same page. We've got a July 1, we've set aside an hour for policy. July 22nd is policy. We will have IIA, but we'll also have the valedictorian salutatorian policy. I think that's IKC
Yes.
to talk about as well. Then we have August 18th or the week before school to get a second reading completed of both IIA and ValSal. Okay. So we have the potential for 3 more meetings to try and work this out. We will have some AR language for you to look at. Sure, Trish, was this up to July 22nd? meeting. Okay,
You're saying you'll have that after July 22nd?
we'll have the 25 days, some AR language for you to peruse.
Right.
And I did not wait for Trish to leave before I said that.
Mhm.
Yeah,
And I want to tell you this because it's fun and Joe's gonna really love this, but Trisha's mom's been playing golf for about a month. And on the second hole at Grants Pass today, she hit a hole in one.
Oh, sweet.
I'm 75 years old. I haven't been out.
Mom, give them left.
So
For 60 years.
they're gonna go and celebrate
Is that a par three?
success.
It is, yeah.
Yeah,
That's impressive.
Yeah,
that is.
it's about 115-yard par three for women.
She's a natural,
110,
she just figured that out.
For reference, I've hit the first green while trying to hit the second green. That's how far off.
You're not unique.
Right
20
there.
That,
22nd's a Tuesday, what's the,
Pulled it left.
what's the third August, third Tuesday in August?
That would be after the board meeting
15th.
though, wouldn't you want the second? You have the first meeting, the first reading on the
I'm
first
just-
meeting and then I'm just asking to write it
We
down.
can do a second reading,
August.
what did you say it was, the third Tuesday of August?
15th.
August 15th, we can do a second reading at a policy meeting.
is that our August board meeting?
We have July 1st.
Is it Friday?
August, no, I need a August,
Oh, August, sorry.
August
Tuesday.
3rd, 19th.
August
sorry.
19th. Would be we could do a second reading of both policies on August 19th
So
and have them
August
ready for the
12th.
school year.
Would be the first reading.
So we can't,
Could be, doesn't have to be.
No, I noticed.
July 8th is off.
Because we already had. a
No,
first
we're
reading.
not meeting July.
What's that?
Joe,
Because we already had a first reading.
No,
That's
because
why
the
we
board can
moved to
declare.
the board meeting
We're gonna
July
do the
1st.
first and second reading, so it's ready for the school. year.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
August 12th would be the board meeting, the regularly scheduled board meeting. And then we would just have a meeting the following week. And
Right.
that would be, the 12th would be first reading, the 19th would be second reading.
so, we're not meeting July 8th because that's why we moved the board.
I mean,
meeting.
August, sorry, August.
Right. Yep, July 1st is the board meeting because we had Joe gonna be on vacation July 8th.
Correct.
So that's why it's 22nd, which
Yes.
keep in mind the third Tuesdays was policy day.
Well, the organizational meeting. Yes. But, yeah, okay. No, because as in the organizational meeting, we'll set.
Why can't we do a first reading on July 1st?
Because we're still working on
I
it.
think you got a policy ready to go?
We're gonna work on it after the meeting, because they want Gary to weigh in. We're not, we haven't even talked about seven.
I thought we could still do the first reading, but then.
Policy meeting on the.
You have to publicize it.
Okay.
Well, I got it.
It's just not.
We're gonna adjourn.
Which one?
The
Our
policy
policy
committee.
committee.
22nd is not on our calendars.
Cost to,
Yeah.
Thanks.
I mean, I wasn't.
I don't know what reference.
Saying it wrong. Fully acknowledge that. I come with the detail, just.
All right.
Believe it or not.
Good. Well, adjourn.